안녕하세요. 정재우입니다. Hi, everyone. I'd like to start by thanking the organizers for having this excellent venue for a very important discussion. It is my great pleasure to share with all of you some of my thoughts on the future of China. I wish I could say the same thing as what Kevin Rudd said. I'm here to help. But somehow, predicting the future is a very difficult task. First, social scientists are not very well equipped to predict a future. As we have seen in the collapse of the Soviet Union, the financial crisis in East Asia, and so on and so forth. Another reason is that black swans actually show up. So it's very difficult, particularly when it comes down to China, the future of China. The challenge is much more daunting. And I have to talk about it in just 15 minutes. So I will try my best to give some answers. These are the two cartoons that I adapted from South China Morning Post early this year. And as you can see, the cartoon on the right side, Chinese officials are trying very hard to maintain the growth rate at 7% or higher. And then on the left side, this cartoon says there are 3 new think tanks are starting up in China. And then the guy sitting at the desk say, well, we don't need more think tanks, we need no tanks, because give me some answers. Okay? I hope I can give you answers by the end of this 15-minute presentation. But even if I cannot, please bear with me. Let me first introduce one book. This book came out in 2006 from a publisher called Rowman and Littlefield. And this book grew out of an international conference that took place in 2004. And in this book, I put together 8 internationally renowned experts to chart China's future from what we had back in 2004. And in that book, we laid out 8 possible scenarios for a future China. If you look at the column on the left, these are the 3 scenarios that I would like to take off the list at this point. Although we considered these 3 possibilities back in 2006, but I think these 3 scenarios are no longer plausible or applicable to the future of China from the vantage point of 2015, which is now. Yugoslavia doesn't exist anymore. It's completely disintegrated. You cannot find it on the map. Now you can refer to Serbia, Bosnia, Herzegovina, and so on and so forth. It's gone. So I don't think that is going to be the future for China. Indonesia, back in 2004, when we actually doing research for this book, Indonesia was economically very, very backward. Politically, it was not a democratic system, and it didn't really have a very strong diplomatic or strategic presence at all. So we didn't think China's future will go down the path of Indonesia. So it's off the list as well. Latin America, a lot of people compare high Gini coefficient, that means income inequalities in China, to those of Latin America. That might be true. But Latin America's diplomatic strategic presence is not felt. Differently, China is now rising and is making its imprint everywhere. So I think the Latin American model is also off the list. If you look at the column in the middle, there are 3 models. Indian model, back in 2004, India's economy was not that great. Of course, it's doing a great job now. But even so, India's presence, particularly from the viewpoint of Northeast Asia, is not felt very strongly. Of course, there is a still possibility that China's past might actually resemble that of India in the future. So there is a possibility for this, the 3 models in the middle, but not really high, I would say. Soviet Union, as you all know, what happened to the Soviet Union now is Russia. It's now still a semi-global power, although its global reach has been constricted considerably. But so there is a still possibility that China might go down actually the path of the Soviet Union, but the possibility, as I see it, is not that high. Final one, the French model. France is a global power, but France cannot make international rules and norms by itself. But France actually makes its imprint by vetoing what others are willing to do, particularly the United States. So it's a global veto power. Will China resemble the path of France? It remains to be seen. So these three possibilities in the middle column still remain, but I would say the likelihood is not very great. If you want me to bet, then my bet will be on the column on the right, either the China model or the American model. What does China model mean? That means authoritarian political system with a highly competitive market-based economic system. China has been successful in sustaining this particular model. If China really should prove successful in the future as well, then I think they will have enormous implications, scholarly as well as policy-wise. American model that is market-based, highly competitive, efficient system, as well as the politically democratic system. Will China eventually go down on this path? I don't know. But if you want me to bet, among these 8 models, probably China will go down, either the China model or, in the long run, the American model. We'll see. I think down the road, probably the easiest task that China can accomplish is economic development. When China will overtake the US in GDP terms, already my colleagues from China have talked about it, but I'd like to lay out a couple of important predictions made by think tanks, not no tanks. Goldman Sachs provided 2 estimates. In 2003, they say China will surpass the United States in GDP terms by 2050. And then 6 years later, in 2009, Goldman Sachs revised their figures to 2027. And then The Economist, the magazine based in London, gave out a prediction of 2019. And Japan's Cabinet Research Office came out with an estimate of 2025. And China's own Academy of Sciences came up with the estimate of 2019. So what does this tell us? I think this seems to suggest between 2019 and 2025, China's GDP is very likely to surpass that of the United States. So I think accomplishing the economic takeover is probably the easiest, and I think it's going to happen very soon. Maybe at the latest within 10 years, the fastest probably within 5 years. Particularly given what my colleagues from China and New Zealand have said about one belt, one road. If that should prove successful, I think it will really give an enormous impetus for China's economic development. Don't forget that America's rise was based in significant part on the gold rush toward California because it expanded spatial as well as the time dimension for development by 50 to 100 years. Okay? So if that One Belt, One Road initiative should become successful, then I think it will be an enormous variable for China's future. So economic dimension, I think there is very little debate on what China will become in 2025. I think more debatable is China's military power. Let me introduce 2 books here. The one on the left is a task force report which came out in 2003 by Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. And this task force report was chaired by Mr. Harold Brown, the former Secretary of Defense. And he put together more than 20 experts, security and military experts in America. And the findings, the conclusion of this task force report is that as of 2003, the publication date of that report, as of 2003, China's military power was lagging behind the United States by 20 years. So if we take that conclusion at face value, that means by 2023, China's military power will most likely equal that of the United States. Now, let me introduce the book on the right. This is the book I edited and will be forthcoming in 2 months, in October, early October this year, by Macmillan. I put together 13 internationally renowned scholars. Among them, 3 were military experts. And they contributed 3 chapters to the book, one on conventional military power, second on nuclear weapons power, and then third one on cyber and space power. And they all agreed to one fact, that is by 2025, China is not going to be a match for the United States on a global theater. So globally, China is not going to be the match for the United States. However, they added a footnote. That is, in the regional settings, particularly East Asia, China will be a peer competitor. Particularly given the technological leapfrogging China has been making in the last 10 years or so, including the anti-ship ballistic missiles, supersonic weapons, and so on and so forth, I think this is real. So on a global setting, China is no match even by 2025. But the conclusion might be quite different in regional settings. So economically, China will be number one by 2025. But militarily, China will be still limited to a regional competitor. Globally, US will still be the hegemon. Then I think we have to think what will be the final game. The final game will be basically something about perceptions, how the US will view China and how China will view US, and most importantly, how the international community and regional states will view the United States and China. In other words, which of the two will be considered as a more benign, more friendly power? I think that perception competition will be very important. Now, given the limited time, I will just focus on the perceptions between the US and China. These are the summary statistics based upon Pew Global Research between 2008 to 2014. And these are Americans' perceptions and Chinese perceptions of the future, whether or not China will surpass the United States. If you look at the third column from the left, about 10% of both Americans and Chinese think China already surpassed the United States. 10% of Americans and Chinese think China already surpassed the United States. That is not correct. That is not the reality. But people already thinking that China already surpassed the United States. If you look at the second column, the percentage of Americans, percentage of Chinese who think China will eventually surpass the United States increasing by the year. So if you look at 2014, 39% of Americans, nearly 40%, and nearly 50% of Chinese are thinking the so-called power transition is inevitable. If you look at the fourth column, the percentage of Americans, Chinese think China will never surpass the United States actually decreasing. So what does this tell us? Both Americans and Chinese, increasing number of Chinese and Americans are thinking that power transition is going to happen. Okay. More importantly, the next slide, these are the summary statistics based upon Gallup polls in the United States between 2001 and 2014. Which country constitutes the biggest enemy in the eyes of America? Okay. If you look at 2001, China was number 2. But since then, until 2011, China never made top 2. It was always Iran, Iraq, North Korea. But after 2010, the year when we all think China began to make some assertive diplomacy, American perceptions of China began to change. So in 2011, China made it to number 2 biggest enemy in the minds of Americans. In 2012, China remained the number 2, but 2014, China finally became number 1 enemy of the United States. Of course, public perceptions change. Public opinions are very fickle. However, given the fact that America is a democratic system, public opinions do matter. It may have enormous influence on policymaking. Okay? So this is not a very good news. However, probably that is why our colleagues and Kevin Rudd were talking about constructive realism. Thus far, I have talked only about China. I haven't talked much about the United States. But I think in order to talk about the future of China, we have to talk about the US. Why? Because it's the game of relativity. If China grows richer and stronger, but US stagnates here, then power transition will definitely take place. But China grows stronger and faster, but US also grows stronger and faster, then power transition is not likely to take place. So this is a very important dynamics we have to bear in mind. History has taught us a lesson that the biggest enemy of an empire or a hegemon is not other country, but it actually is a self-complacency. These are the quotations that I got from British politicians in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Mr. Benjamin Disraeli, he was the Earl of Beaconsfield in UK. He made this speech in 1872. 1872 is a very significant year because that was the year when the GDP of the United States surpassed that of UK. Okay? And this Earl Disraeli says, I express here my confident conviction that there never was a moment in our history when the power of England was so great and her resources so vast and inexhaustible. 30 years later, Mr. Joseph Chamberlain, who was a very renowned politician, made another speech in 1903 along the similar lines. UK has never been powerful, never been stronger. But what happened? We all know what happened 40 years later. In 1944, the Bretton Woods system was created, giving the United States the status of a hegemon, making UK nearly irrelevant in international relations. So I think what the US will do and what US will be able to do in the 10 years and after will probably shape the future of China as well. Thanks for listening.